U.S. Army colonel with service both in Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom. He's the author of, including the book tonight, excluding the book tonight, 4 other books about Vietnam, including Withdrawal, Reassessing America's Final Years in Vietnam, which was published in 2017. He's here tonight to speak about his latest book on Men's Adventure Magazine's War and Gender in the Cold War. And joining him after about 45 minutes of discussion about his book, and we're really looking forward to seeing some of the remarkable illustrations from it, I'm going to introduce Dr. Amanda Chesham, who is a senior lecturer in the School of Security Studies here at King's College London. And her work covers security and gender, and she's published widely, I mean, too widely for me to give a list of her publications. But her work spans an enormous range of themes, including private military contractors, masculinity, gender, and war. And we're really delighted to have her here tonight just to comment on Greg's book. We're going to allow about 25 to 30 minutes for questions, and you can present your questions in 2 ways. One of which is you can just type in your questions into the Q&A box function, or you can raise your hands as well. If you want to start during the presentation to add your questions, we'll track them and we'll give you the opportunity either to ask them or I will read them out. But with no further ado, I'll just introduce and turn over the chair to Greg.
Great, thanks so much, Joe and Amanda. It's a pleasure to be here and a real honor. Obviously, like most military historians, Sir Michael Howard has been a huge influence on my life and my scholarship. So it's a real honor to be here. And I would say I wish I was there in person, but I imagine the weather in San Diego is probably a little bit nicer than it is in London. So this isn't a bad balance. So I really appreciate being here with you all this evening. And tonight I'm going to be talking about manly men doing manly things with other men. And with that, just a warning that what I'm going to talk about tonight and show you all, there's quite a bit of sexist and misogynistic language and imagery, but I think those images are an important part of the story. So I'd like to share those with you. And in fact, we'll do that now. So what I'd like to discuss this evening is what were known as men's adventure magazines, which were published in the United States from the early 1950s until the late 1970s, also known as the Pulps. They very much catered to a white working class audience, a male audience, which really turned out to be the same target audience that made up the bulk of American ranks in the Vietnam War. So there are some linkages there between popular culture and the American experience in Vietnam that I'd like to talk about this evening. And what these magazines do, and you can really see from this image here from American Manhood in January of 1953, is within popular culture, I think they're fairly unique in the Cold War era, and the fact that they're bringing together 2 strands of popular conceptions of masculinity. The first, as you see here, is the heroic warrior, very much, I think, kind of emoting what we'll see with Arnold Schwarzenegger in the 1980s and 90s, and also the sexual conqueror. And although these magazines, I think, were considered at the time and since to be kind of lowbrow art, if you will, my sense is they offer quite a bit in terms of cultural insights at a time when many American men, especially after World War II, are worried about their masculinity, and they're very much worried about the domestic and foreign threats that are posed to that masculinity. And the linkages between popular culture and how they're expressed in these magazines is what I'd like to chat about this evening, and how that popular culture may have contributed to US soldiers' behavior among the local population in Vietnam when the Americans went there in 1965. Now, I want to caveat this right up front. I'm not suggesting in any way that if you read these magazines, you're going to act in a certain way when you go to Vietnam. But what I am suggesting is that these magazines, as one example of cultural norms that are prevalent in the 1950s and 1960s, are leaving men with a very distorted view of war. And they help normalize certain expectations. And those expectations, I think, saw hypermasculinity and perhaps even sexual violence as acceptable parts of what the experience of war would be like. And so my sense is that these young men that are going to Vietnam had imbibed this consistent messaging that linked military service with sexual entitlement. And thus those two strands of the heroic warrior and the sexual conqueror, which were part and parcel of these magazines. And so what I'm going to suggest tonight is that these culturally constructed expectations of war matter. And the main expectation that is derived from these men's pulps is that soldiers could, and perhaps, at least if you're reading the magazines, should conquer the local female population while they're serving overseas. Now, context, like anything, I think is incredibly important. And part of these magazines' popularity stems from the fact that they're well within the popular narratives of the Cold War. Much of that time period, as we're seeing, especially in the early and mid 1950s, is the idea that the United States is in a persistent state of war. We can perhaps in the Q&A session talk a little bit about how we see some of those similarities with the idea of persistent state of war today. And the increasing belief that there is a national security state that is required to defeat the communists in this larger Cold War, and the inability for Americans to demobilize after World War II. And so there is a need here culturally for men to be attracted to war. And these magazines are an incredible part of that need. Stories of heroism and battle, as you see here on these two covers, are a mainstay of the magazines. They're energetic promoters of the armed forces. Numerous magazines will declare that if you join the armed forces, then you're automatically going to become a man. So this is the surest path to achieving manhood, is through military service. And there's no way to better promote military service and the value of that by linking it to sex. You can see here on the right-hand side, the battle cry image from 1959, that there is an expectation of sexual rewards by your heroism in battle. And a number of articles discuss this. There's one from Saga in June of 1964, just a year before American combat troops are getting ready to deploy to Vietnam, titled "French and Arab Girls Discover Our Bedroom Commando." And it's supposedly an autobiographical account of this Navy demolition veteran who served in World War II in France and North Africa. And on its face, it's ridiculous. But again, what it does, I think, is promote this idea that there are sexual rewards to be had by military service. And clearly the stories here are oversimplified. There are these reductive narratives of good versus evil. The villains are easily understandable. And so that's one part of how these magazines are portraying the Cold War. But I think read a different way, these pulps might also be seen as a form of escapism. There are deep anxieties here about not measuring up in this rapidly changing post-war society. Challenge magazine in August of 1959 is one example. Prints this story about these millions of anxiety-ridden American men. And that theme is present throughout many of these stories. And again, in Q&A, we might talk about some of the similarities that we see here in the United States, so the incel movement or the Proud Boys and these anxiety-ridden young men and trying to escape these rapidly changing aspects of post-war society. You see on the right-hand side, the mental castration of husbands. This is another theme that's present in these magazines. That there are frustrated females out there that are waging an all-out campaign against their mates. They're possibly going to not just convert American men to housemaids, but to actually emasculate them. So again, I think what you see here with these magazines is the possibility that they're an antidote to what the authors, the pulp writers, saw as stifling wives and domestic responsibilities that were part of the Cold War experience. And so, in a sense, one way to remedy that is to create this new American man. And to do that, many of the magazines will focus themselves on the male body. You saw from the initial picture there of American Manhood, which is actually not an adventure magazine, but more of a weightlifting magazine. Joe Weider starts off his career with these magazines like American Manhood. You see on the left-hand side, Charles Atlas, who really is, I think, the ultimate nerd fantasy. But there is a military component at play here. I think the problem, however, is that these bodies are an idealized version of masculinity that may have seemed improbable for the average reader to attain. And that is problematic, especially when you put this in the context of the Cold War. There is a major concern in these magazines asking a fundamental question, and that is, what if American men, especially those that have been feminized by post-war consumerist society, might not be able to meet the demands of this new war? And this new war is present throughout all of these magazines. There's a story about the Red plan to conquer America. There are plenty of stories about dealing with the post-apocalyptic nuclear war. And so true heroes are needed to not only stand up against these stifling wives on the home front, but also against these communists that are both home and abroad. Clearly, you see with these two magazine articles here, or covers here, that true heroes are also ones that will save damsels in distress. One article says that we need warriors in this Cold War that have the requisite balls to not only defend the nation from communists, but from women right here at home. And so there's a number of anxieties that are at play here in these magazines that I think are important to evaluate as we're looking about this idealized version of militarized masculinity. And as I mentioned, this threat is not only from communists at home and abroad, but also from women right here at home. If you take a look at the photo, the excerpt from American Manhood on the right-hand side, there is the possibility here that women are toxic vehicles of disease. And so the additional problem, I think, for young pulp readers, and you notice on the right-hand side picture here, that it's mostly the women that are passing along syphilis. Those are these toxic vehicles that are problematic, I think, for many young readers, especially virginal ones, of how do you distinguish whether a woman is desirous or dangerous? And the possibility that these magazines bring up is that they're both. And so there is a tension within these magazines about revolving around, I think, desire and fear of women. And I think what this does is promote an underlying sexism that is an important part of our story here, of pitting men against women. And all the while throughout this are fears of homosexuality, as you see on the left-hand side with the storyline that homosexuals ruined Hitler's Luftwaffe. And clearly this comes out of the social context of the Kinsey findings in the late 40s and early 1950s, suggesting that over 35 to some 37% of adult men have engaged in homosexual activity, which again adds yet another tension within these magazines. Now, this isn't to say, of course, that all women are dangerous. There are plenty of depictions of women here. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But here you see that women clearly are sexually appealing as well. These magazines do take their cue from World War II era pinups. And so within every single magazine, there are photo spreads of what they call Cheesecake Girls. And yet, despite this, right after this photo session in this edition of Man's Day, there is an article about other young women, usually from lower classes, and we can talk about the classism piece of this as well in the Q&A if you'd like, of women being portrayed as living outside of traditional sexual norms and thus being a danger to American men and Cold War society. That these women in the post-war era, that Rosie the Riveter has come home, shed her inhibitions and created sexual havoc across America. And that's an important part of this story as well. So I think if the pulp definition of masculinity emerges in these magazines as fragile in relation to women, then perhaps one's manhood could better be demonstrated on the field of battle. And that's where we see the aspect of pulp war stories coming to the forefront of men's adventure magazines. These heroes never suffer any of these frustrations at all. They shine in a wartime environment. They always pass the test of manhood with flying colors. You can see here on the right-hand side of, this is an American POW, and look how he's depicted in relation to his Japanese captor. We'll talk about the racial components of these magazine stories in a moment. And so what these magazines are doing, I think, is seducing especially younger readers with the opportunity to learn about the supposed man-making experiences of combat and of being a veteran. And at the same time, they're also appealing to veterans themselves who are reading stories of World War II and Korea from some pretty major authors and military historians. Richard Tregaskis, Robert Leckie, S.L.A. Marshall, Norman Mailer is writing articles in these magazines. And so much of what Americans, at least those that are reading these magazines, are learning about combat in World War II fits within that duality of heroic warrior and sexual conqueror, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide here. And yet, like much of the Cold War America, this is a sanitized version of World War II and a sanitized version of reality. And I think that will have an important component to play here as well. And within these storylines, the good war narrative absolutely flourishes. And so too does what I would argue is the prototype of what we'll see later in the 1980s as these magazine articles and storylines, and clearly you can see here with the illustrations as well, a prototype of hyper-masculinity that's going to emulate Rambo long before he goes to Vietnam. So heroism is at the center of adventure. We do see this militarized version of masculinity. We do see it, I think, as an antidote to Cold War emasculation. And also importantly, I think what we see here is that war can be a meritocratic experience, that anybody can be a hero here. And so even the weakest boys could aspire to be real men when they read the stories and see the illustrations in these articles. And I think just as importantly, we see the possibility that this hard-minded, hard-hearted heroism might be an anxious shield that's flung up against female sexuality. And to return one more time to the storyline here of women's, the pulp's multiple constructions of women, it has to leave, I think, many readers dubious of their own prospects, right? That what do we think of beauty and the definition of beauty as we're reading these magazines? Sex is alluring, but it's also incredibly dangerous. This magazine article from 1963, Inside a Sex School for Spies, talks about communist women using sex as a weapon, using their bodies as a weapon, being a destructive force as bad as the nuclear bomb. And the article calls it sexological warfare. And so the frequency within these storylines of femme fatales being at the center of the story, I think, is really important and symbolic of these larger male anxieties during the Cold War. And so women might offer love and sex, but they also might offer deception and humiliation, and even in many storylines, death. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is a racial component to this. As dangerous as women are and were in the right locales in these magazines, they're also sexually available. And it's difficult to ignore the Orientalism that is part and parcel of these magazines and the perceived sexual availability of the exotic Asian or exotic Oriental. And these sexist attitudes toward all women, as the magazine called them, of darker races, is an important part of the storylines in many of the magazines. These women are always sexually available. And so the level of objectification, I would argue, thrives in these magazines, and not just in the storylines, but also in the advertisements as well. And clearly there's a history behind this. If we think about these convenient plot devices in which the hero washes ashore or lands on an island inhabited by savage others, but also sexually attractive and available local women, we might think about earlier narratives that go all the way back to John Smith and Pocahontas. That beyond the frontiers of civilization, there are these bare-chested protagonists who will not only quickly master their new domain, but also then will be able to be rewarded by that with the most beautiful of local women. The final depiction of women, I think, that's important for us in these magazines is the fact that, yes, many of them, in fact, did fight alongside men. I doubt there were many instances of foxhole girls of Vietnam fighting alongside American men, despite what this illustration from December of 1965 shows us. But this is important for us because I think if men can prevail over Nazi dominatrices, and there were plenty of them in these magazines, or savage tribal leaders, or women that were strong enough to fight alongside them, then that made the victory all the sweeter. That if strong men could best women like this in this illustration from December of 1965, and this is only a month after the November 1965 Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, the first American battle between North Vietnamese conventional forces and American armed forces. That made the victory over these strong women all the more fitting. And so we might pause for a moment here and ask, what is the impact of all this, especially on the expectation that men had by the time they were thinking about and ultimately arriving in Vietnam? And what I think happens here is that these magazines help create a certain narrative where heroic warriors are not only battlefield victors, but they're also sexual conquerors as well. That this is an idealized version of manhood, however warped it may be, and it clearly is warped in these magazines. But for many of the readers, I think it's enticingly within reach. And that, I think, is the main problem once Americans land in Vietnam. That these pulp readers, now that they're in uniform, are finding the reality of fighting in South Vietnam running far afield from the fantasies that they've built up in their own heads from reading these magazines. That these convincing articles in these sensational magazines don't relate to reality. And so what happens when that's the case? Now, yes, there are plenty of articles in these magazines in the mid and late 1960s, which offer a message that this is a new kind of war, that this is not like your father's war in World War II or Korea. There are no set piece battles. There are frustrating engagements with an elusive enemy, the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are terrorizing the population. But the problem, I think, is that even in these articles, this experience of combat doesn't relate to this triumphal rhetoric that's in the magazine articles and in the illustrations. And so I think for those men in particular who are raised on this storyline about how war will provide them an opportunity to prove themselves, the reality of war in Vietnam has got to be disconcerting in the extreme. That the reality of war just doesn't match the narrative of the fantasy in the men's adventure magazines. And so what the soldiers themselves are forced to deal with then is what do I do with this reality? And the magazines don't help them. They remain stuck in these earlier conceptions of warfare, even as they're talking about how this is a new kind of war. And I think in many ways, the war in Vietnam is not only going to prove frustrating implicitly for American soldiers, but for Americans more generally. And I think perhaps more so for those young men who are raised on these images and storylines that are perpetuated in these magazines. And I don't think the Pulp writers are alone in their struggle of making sense of this really disorienting experience. I think the same could be said for soldiers, even senior American military commanders and policymakers, that they're unsure about what to do with this experience in Vietnam. And to make matters worse, along the way, it seems to be that the very definition of heroism might be changing in this environment. If you look at the 1968 film, The Green Berets with John Wayne, his antics, the Duke's military antics on the big screen are provoking ridicule from American soldiers serving in Vietnam, not admiration. This whole idea of being gung-ho is less important by the latter stages of the American war in Vietnam than having a good head, as one lieutenant will say it. And yet what I found really fascinating here is that these magazines are still popular and still enticing, even in Vietnam. I had a chance to look at the PX, the post-exchange records at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. In 1967, of the top 20 best-selling magazines that are being sold in the PX system in Vietnam, 13 of those fall into men's adventure category, which I think is pretty phenomenal. Unsurprisingly, I think Playboy tops the list, but adventure magazines are filling most of these remaining spots, selling in the tens of thousands each month. And in fact, even in 1967, the annual magazine sales are reaching $12 million within the United States and in Vietnam. So clearly, this is an enticing story that's hard to break away from. And you can see it, I think, best explained or best showcased here from this illustration of an article in February of 1967 of the magazine struggling with how best to depict the enemy. There is prejudice here, clearly. The term gook is used throughout. The racism is clear in these magazines. And yet there is a begrudging respect for the fighters in the National Liberation Front, called the Viet Cong or the VC derisively. One magazine says that he can outwalk, outcrawl any Western fighting man. So there is a begrudging respect here. And yet they have to balance that respect with the fact that all communists are inherently evil and even cowardly, which is a mainstay of the larger construct of the magazines themselves. And clearly you can see here the problems of working through what to do with Vietnam. In Pulp world, these savage enemies within the communist camp are always killed by American warriors. It's what American warriors do best. It's clear here, I think, the phallic symbology that you see in this illustration. And yet in reality, the communists too often hold the tactical initiative in Vietnam. And so this type of imagery and storyline, again, just doesn't match the American experience in Vietnam. And so I think the best way that the magazines try and deal with that inconsistency is to focus on strong leaders. You see here on the right-hand side, Lieutenant Colonel at the time of this illustration, Colonel Hal Moore, the American commander at the Battle of Ia Drang, who was depicted by Mel Gibson in We Were Soldiers. A focus on World War II veterans or their sons. George S. Patton, who is the son of George S. Patton Jr., is commanding the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. He gets a storyline in these magazines, plenty of storylines on Medal of Honor recipients. And so what the Pulp writers will do is dust off these World War II narratives in which American GIs are excelling at the tactical level. And they link the World War II generation with the Vietnam generation in a very purposeful manner, that both conflicts need heroes. Vietnam proves no exception to that. And so what the magazines are going to do is focus on the courageous exploits of individuals as a way, I think, to intimate to their readers that the United States is in fact making progress in this hard-fought war. And like the stories in World War II and Korea, war can still be meritocratic here. Plenty of Vietnam era stories in the men's pulps of young teens, 19, 20-year-old youngsters who were given the chance to prove their courage. They achieve their manhood in battle. That these baby-faced warriors have an opportunity, just like they did in World War II in Korea, to demonstrate their grit, if you will. The problem, however, is that by the time you get to the late 1960s, that warrior image, which is so central to men's magazines, it appears far murkier than it did a decade earlier, and perhaps even less convincing to young, even working class readers. And there are those then that are questioning whether the pulps are selling a version of a battlefield heroism that might not in fact exist in the real world. And you can see that here in this March 1966 article or storyline, which just doesn't match the reality of Vietnam. There are very few American warriors that on their own are linking up with a beautiful Asian woman and working their way behind enemy lines to evoke the bridge over the River Kwai imagery and destroy a strategic bridge. That, you know, war is designed to be traumatic and disoriented, and the magazines kind of move that trauma and disorienting experience to the sideline of their stories, so they can focus on the heroism piece of it. And I think what happens is that as the magazines are interpreting the war in such a fantastical way, as I mentioned, the artists and the writers are concocting a Vietnam that bears little resemblance to the real world. And because the way Vietnam is portrayed and the way reality runs so far afield from that, I think soldiers are forced to reconcile with this really yawning gap between truth and fantasy, and trying to make something irrational seem more rational. And as I mentioned, I don't think the pulp writers and artists are making this any easier, because they're crafting their own version of Vietnam. These artists and writers have very little idea of the culture and the geography, the language of their topics. They're still putting forth this idea that American soldiers and Marines, even with their legs shot off, can be top aces, as one magazine says, or if they return home, they're not returning home as broken warriors, but as in the past, real men who are now going to return home to be sexually rewarded for their adventures. And clearly by the late 1960s, that's not happening in the United States. And so as this indecisive war in Vietnam drags on year after bloody year, I think American soldiers and the readers of these magazines are finding it all the more challenging to discover that adventure that was promised to them. And I think that generates a lingering sense of further anxiety that Vietnam might not be this man-making experience that was publicized in the macho pulps. And so what I wondered and asked in my research was that if these magazines did not reflect true war, if they crafted a fantasy land, then perhaps the soldiers and readers of these magazines then look to sexual access to and power over the local population as a way to reconcile those inconsistencies. That if they couldn't find the heroic warrior in Vietnam, maybe they could find the sexual conqueror in Vietnam and still become a man through that experience. Now, again, I think we need to be really, really careful here. Did the magazines contribute to sexual violence in Vietnam? I'm not so sure. And I don't argue, and I don't think we should, that if you read the magazines, you were going to go to Vietnam and engage in sexual violence or even rape. But what I think the magazines do is provide rhetorical space, if you will, for readers to think along the lines of sexual conquest and to deem the South Vietnamese women as opportunities for sex, opportunities to prove their manhood, opportunities for them to demonstrate some type of power in a disconcerting environment. And the problem, as we should not be surprised, is that relatively few Vietnamese women acted according to these male fantasies. And so I think when half of that Pulp vision, the noble warrior, collapsed, I think it was plausible that many American GIs turned to the other half, the sexual conqueror of foreign women, as a way to satisfy their sexual or their psychological needs for a sense of control in this chaotic environment. And especially so if the Vietnamese population was hostile, which was an assumption of many American soldiers, then it was acceptable for American GIs to retaliate against women with threats and even acts of sexual violence. Now, yes, some American men, I think, were using rape as a weapon of war. We do see many of these pulp heroes in the magazines being forceful and uncompromising. They don't engage in sex, they conquer their prey. But I think what's important for this story here is that simply to blame the pressure cooker of combat as the sole reason for incidents of sexual assault and rape is a way for men to satiate their sexual desires in a stressful wartime environment. I think that misses a really important part of the story about how perpetrators understand themselves and their actions. That these norms, gender and cultural, were imparted to servicemen long before they joined the armed forces. And so for me, I think it's vital to examine how these culturally produced representations of sex and violence and war helped, I think, shape American behavior in Vietnam toward the Vietnamese population by suggesting to them what was acceptable. And so if you did see assault of Vietnamese women play out in reality, it may have been acceptable to you because that's what you were told through viewing pop culture within the magazines for decades before Americans actually went to Vietnam. So again, I think it's important for us to think about the space that is opened up here for American GIs serving in Vietnam and how they saw their actions and the actions of others as acceptable. Now, these magazines will fade in popularity by the late 1960s and early 1970s. The counterculture movements that are popular in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the sexual liberation, a new wave of feminism, they all pose, I think, stark alternatives to the pulp conservatism that is part of the men's adventure magazines. And these Vietnam stories just don't hold appeal as they did of the World War II and Korea generation. And many of those stories then will get replaced by these popular accounts of veterans who are struggling to adjust in their own post-war society, of trying to reintegrate into society, of being damaged by Vietnam and being dangerous to themselves and, if not, society as a larger whole. And so what it does is it kind of turns the pulp narrative completely on its head. Now, of course, by the 1980s and the Reagan years, we do see that veteran as victim plot line play itself out in a way. And it runs its course. And clearly you see that with Stallone's Rambo and Chuck Norris's Missing in Action films and the Schwarzenegger films. And so as sexist and as misogynistic as these magazines are, they still have a life, I think, that outlasts them, even though those pulp stories are not as popular in the late 1960s and 1970s. All right, so what do we make of all this? First off, I think that war stories are important, and war stories are not just tales of military engagement and battlefield tactics, but they also tell us something about how and why societies desire to remember war, and particularly how and why male veterans desire to remember war in certain ways. And these magazines, I think, suggest a symbiotic relationship between that memory and heroes, that we want to remember war by remembering heroes. And in fact, I would argue that we can't really divorce those. That how can somebody really become a hero if their story isn't told? The problem, I think, for many veterans is that this experience in Vietnam repudiated much of what the pulp magazines had been selling for such a long time. That war wasn't heroic. It wasn't a man-making experience. Asian women weren't submissive. They weren't a remedy to war's disillusionments. And so I think it's important for us then to think more deeply about how we remember war and how we portray war in popular culture. I think young men in particular often find meaning in images and structures of male superiority, especially when the protagonist is a bold and heroic, manly warrior. And so how we talk about violence and sex matters. And I think what these magazines also suggest for us is that war should not be the only, even primary rite of passage into manhood. That pop culture heroes should not rely on sexual conquest for our approval. That our popular narratives of what it means to be a man don't need to rest on soldiers dominating their enemy and women simultaneously in the same breath. And I think finally what's important for us here is that redefining adventure in war may in fact help young men and women better cope with the realities they face when immersed in a wartime environment. These magazines fostered a version of adventure and masculinity and heroism in the 1950s and 1960s that arguably demanded conformity to a very narrow definition of what it meant to be a man. And I think it's important for us to open up conversations that offer alternate models of masculinity, because as we've seen with the Vietnam experience, that there are consequences when our soldiers who are encouraged by fantasy assertively seek out opportunities to demonstrate their dominance and come up short. And the problem, I think, with these magazines is that in the storylines and the illustrations, that these pulp warriors never suffer the consequences of war, but real soldiers and real civilians who are caught in the middle of war most certainly do. All right, Amanda, I think I'm about out of time, so I'm going to stop my share.
Great, thank you so much for that, Greg. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your book with me. It was a fascinating read, and thank you, Joe and Sir Michael Howard Center, for giving me the opportunity to discuss your book with you, Greg, and with the wider audience today. The book sets itself up as an exploration between military history, popular culture, and a particular version of military masculinity. You offer a fascinating account of how this particular version is being produced through these pulp mags, and how they become associated with and desired by particularly white working class males. This ideal and aspirational masculinity you show is inextricably linked to misogyny at home and abhorrent sexual violence against women over there in Vietnam. Popular culture, as your work details, is not a space divorced from politics or a reflection of a pre-existing reality, but productive of a particular political imaginary of militarism and nationalism. And I think you actually could, I read that, but I think you could actually tease that out more, but that could be for the next book that we talk about, right? Throughout the chapters, you offer in great detail how these pulp magazines produce images and texts around achieving manhood and glory through war pursuits, gratuitous violence, and sexual aggression. Women maintain, as you highlight, conflicting sexual roles as grateful, sex-crazed people who've been rescued, sexually domineering harlots, villains needing discipline through sexual domination, easy and hypersexed available women who seduce GIs, Housewives who castrate men and their manhood through domesticity and achieving their own feminist empowerments also feature, alongside women who are desiring hyper masculine men and men who don't take no for answer, right? So you highlight all of these very conflicting gender depictions of women. So, you know, pulp mags are set against what you describe as a perpetual state of war, but of the rise of communism, but also the rise of white middle class feminism and female empowerment, as you highlight Betty Friedan a few times, and broader liberal economies, civil rights movements, whereby these returning white veterans from Korea and then the young working class white males are situated within these broader politics. And then this is where the mags themselves are situated. So these pulp writings offer a space of escapism, as you highlight, but also camaraderie, and where they can share stories of trauma alongside of adventure, right? A sense of community often is built in the magazines that you highlight through different op-eds and whatnot. And also importantly, these magazines give legitimacy, or at least a vernacular, for veterans' own participation in coercive sex or, you know, brutalizing rape of Vietnam women. And you make clear that these magazines were obviously not meant for women audience. Women's voice is very rarely featured, but importantly, they weren't meant for Black or Asian men either, right? I think here, war and warscapes detailed in these mags offer a space and a space for these men, again, to escape from the women problems at home, right? These aggressive women who want to castrate them. But I'd also read more than just awful feminist castrating men at home, you know, and then these men seeking through these mags as a way to escape and live out aspirational glory days of their manhoods. I think, you know, in times of war, and I would, you know, I read, and looking at the images as well, and the different texts that you forensically go through, is that women also serve, particularly women back home, also serve a key moral marking of why we're even going to war in the first place, right? Where, you know, I'm thinking of Elstein's Beautiful Souls kind of thing. We go to protect these women from the hordes that we see. So it'd be nice maybe to tease that out, to see if you saw any of that kind of moral kind of imagining of women in these mags here. So, you know, here gender depictions of women and men are always embedded in a broader culture, in particular your case of whiteness, imperialism, and sexism, which you make explicit throughout your book. Sorry, I have tons of notes and I'm trying to keep to time. It was a fascinating read. Yeah, and as you say, you know, these militarized spaces continue to have the white male soldier as the protagonist in all of them, who fights with valor and enjoys sex from white women, and then orientalized women who are either, you know, deserving of being raped or grateful for being rescued. So it's always sex and violence feeds out in great detail. And sometimes it's a troubling read, to be honest, looking at, you know, at the very detailed accounts of all of this. Yeah, I think, you know, a question that you raise, which I would actually like you to comment more on, because I felt like you left the answer for the reader to discern, and I'd really like you to see if you could reflect on that more, is on page 188, you ask how GIs who commit evil deeds may have judged them normal given the wartime setting, and what makes killing or raping civilians immoral at home yet acceptable in Vietnam. And I think that's a really fascinating political question. So I think, you know, this question is also located firmly within, you know, feminist and queer political projects and research, right? And I very much encourage you. I do see that you've engaged with feminism, but I think, you know, engage with those political questions. They're really important questions here. You know, and I'm reminded of the work of Cynthia Enlow, of course, but also Catherine Baker, Megan McKenzie, Erin Belkin. They immediately come to mind when we think about answering this question, thinking about the structural, affective, and embodied entanglements of militarism and masculinities within these historical contexts, but also, as you know, I think you allude to in your presentation, how they carry currency today, right? Like the ways in which these, you know, we continue to affectively find pleasure in them or whatnot, right? So I think that's really important. I think, you know, it's a pretty uncontroversial statement now to say that sex violence, militarism, and military operations go hand in hand. They have historically, they continue to do so. You know, indeed, sexually available women, whether coerced or otherwise, have always been located within or amongst Western military operations. And your book gives a great historical account of that, you know, both locating in the MAGs within Korea or communist kind of warfare, but, you know, also within Vietnam as well. The explanations as to why this is the case becomes more political, right? So we can say, yeah, sex and military operations go hand in hand, but why? So I think here again, this is where, for me, feminist research comes to the fore, right? And it's been very good at exploring this over the past decades, raising visibility, not only to move beyond thinking about sexual violence against women, but also, you know, men and boys too, is not a spoil of war or something that's unfortunate but inevitable, but there's other explanations that we can look at here. And of course, what you know, grapple with was the question of, are these a few bad apples, or are these, you know, individuals that are let down from the promise of war and achieving their manhood and frustration? And I think, you know, a lot of feminists clearly agree with you in that that's part of the story. But my questions that are coming, you'll learn that have more of a structural aspect to them, because I think what feminists also do is they link you know, this sort of violence to the broader institutionalizing of warfare and policing, the planning and the training that goes into waging warfare as also very key to understanding. You know, so it's more institutional, organized, structural component of this that helps us get at why these atrocities are committed in the first place. You know, as you engage with too, feminists have long argued that the intimate relationship between military masculinity and sexual violence, exploring how broader popular culture depictions of men and manhood and acceptable and honorable masculinities are located within that sexual virility and physical prowess and domination. I mean, this is what makes you a man, right? And they're but they're also linked to institutionalizing factors that goes into training these women and men to commit lethal force when necessary on behalf of the state, right? So linking to how do then these pulp mags kind of, or the imaginings of these masculinities also might appear, whether intended or not, in training, in the training and the planning and the preparation. Which you highlight a little bit when you're talking about the training of, you know, the gendered language that's used to denigrate or valorize recruits. So indeed, sexual violence continues to parallel military operations, both over there, but also at home. How it manifests and is legitimized is located in particular cultural contexts. So be it gang sexual violence of drug cartels, to Western imperial operations that involve sexual trafficking and violence against locals, to the increased sexual violence of male soldiers on male and other female colleagues that we see, you know, in Iraq, for example. There's testimonies of women, female soldiers not wanting to use the loo after dark, right, for fear of being violated. So there's the sexual violence that's inherent. I think I shouldn't say it's inherent. It just seems to be a part of militarism that I think, and military operations that I think we need to think through and unpack of why that might be the case, which clearly people who've served in the military and who, you know, are former like officers such as yourself, but, you know, I served in the military too. These are uncomfortable conversations to have, but there's something we need to think about of what is this link, right? Which you do grapple with in your book through Pulp Megs, but I'm asking you to think more of the institutional aspects of this. Finally, the last statement before I move on to the questions or of engagements is, I think what's really important here too is and especially when you're coming to grips of the violence over there, how these can be good all around, American boys who eat apple pie, who are, treat their mom as well. Why over there do they resort to this sort of violence, right? And I think more of a spatialization understanding, like space and militarism are important, I think, here in thinking through this. And I'm reminded of, actually a talk that was earlier today and the work of Jesse Crane-Sieber, who shows how imaginings of war-torn savagery and chaotic spaces for which GIs land into, right? We're going into these already savage, chaotic kind of spaces, immediately disconnects them and the broader US imperialism as potentially one of the root causes of that violence to begin with, right? So it just already divorces it. We just land in, it's already there. And Shireen Razek also shows, I think, quite convincingly how the gendered colonial imaginings of war over there gives legitimacy to this fully developed white soldier who is professionally and fully formed and virtuous, who lands into these chaotic spaces. And it's the savagery of warfare that corrupts them, rather than thinking, so then again, that lets imperialism off the hook again, right? So it replaces everything that's bad in the world. This happens over there and not necessarily, closer to home. So, and Crane-Sieber extends this analysis to show how these warscape metaphors play out in cities throughout the United States. You can see in the increased Black Lives Matter movements, the militarization of police forces, the ways in which war metaphor is used, back home, which I find fascinating. I think your work can touch on too, is like, how do these technologies and logics that are happening in Vietnam kind of come back home as well too. So, again, I love your work. I want it linking. I'm questioning more. This is my feminist political economy curiosity coming out. I'm questioning more of where it links to the structural politics. So my first question to you is what I found interesting in the overall kind of whiteness in the making of this particular masculinity that you talk about is you mentioned, how this is all about white men, white working class men. So Black Latino men weren't fully men or part of this. They couldn't get the spoils of war the way white men can. And so they were excluded. Their bodies were really excluded in these magazines. And I wonder if you can say a bit more about the actual operation of whiteness here. So you talk about race in terms of Orientalism, in terms of Blackness, but I wonder if you can say something about what is whiteness doing in this case. So as an aspirational ideal or as a logic, and how it links to patriarchy and imperialism in claiming kind of this militarized lost manhood, or this, what is whiteness doing, and to sum up in this regard. And by extension, what I find fascinating too is these pulp mags, in a lot of ways, as you highlight, are so divorced often from a particular reality that's happening on the ground, because also you have, at the same time competing Black masculinities, right? Around the rise of the Black Panthers, but also Muhammad Ali and the Black masculinity rooted in boxing and rooting in, not going to Vietnam, right? So I'm wondering, did that ever feature in these mags, or how did that kind of connect to those competing masculinities that, that were happening within which these mags were, situated in that broader politics? The final question, again, is more on race too. Especially, your chapter on women in Vietnam, again, so much richness in there. And it reminds me of the work of Sunny Wone in particular, and how they speak about white sexual imperialism that arises actually out of Vietnam. And it leads to, so the submissive, sexually available, soft-skinned Oriental kind of imagining of the women that that you talked about, this actually leads to mail order brides and a global circulation of these women, again, typecast as hypersexual and submissive, right? And this continues to inform, Asian women and Western kind of relationships today. So I wonder, and I'm also thinking about Catherine Moon's work, another feminist work who explored sexual violence of Asian women by United States forces, but other colonial kind of forces of the time. And again, they take it out of just an individual agency to the broader structures of this sexual violence and the ways in which the U.S. military, but also the regional governments, but also the Vietnam or Southeast Asian countries, state leaders were implicated in this political economy of sex. And so I wonder if if you could reflect upon that, right? Move it from the individual soldier to how basically structures of this particular militarized masculinities manifest away from, questions around the individual choice and agency to commit violence to broader structural critique of US militarism more broadly. And I will be quiet there. I just want to say, love the book, so rich, and hopefully my questions and commentary to you make sense. So I'll mute myself now.
Huge thanks, Amanda. It's a compelling analysis of Greg's book, and thank you, Greg, for a fantastic talk. And this, we have a few questions in the question box. I just want to remind everyone in the audience, you please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A or raise your hand in the chat, and we'll come back to you. But I want to just give Greg the opportunity to comment on Amanda's analysis. So I'll switch my screen off now.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Amanda. So do we have like another 2, 3, 4 hours to do this? So let me kind of work through a few of these. You mentioned the veteran community. I do think that's really important that they would never use this language in a sense, but these magazines really were, I think, a safe space, if you will, for veterans that are coming home. They're allowed to share stories with themselves. Many of the writers are veterans themselves. And so, these magazines really are a community for veterans and many of the authors themselves are veterans. So I think there is something to this idea that you mentioned about the veteran community being an important part of the storyline. And in a sense, I think that's structural as well, right? There's certain structural expectations of what veterans will do when they come home. And again, my sense with these magazines is that there is a structural component that helps set up the expectations of what the rewards will be when you come home from war or while you're in war itself. To me, the racial component of this, again, from an institutional, structural, cultural component that all intertwine is that African Americans cannot share in those rewards, especially if the storyline is focused on, as many of them do, in World War II Europe. We can't have a young African American heroic warrior in that storyline also be a sexual conqueror in Germany. There are problems with that narrative, I think, structurally from a racialized standpoint in the 1950s and early 1960s that almost inevitably force African Americans away outside of the storyline to focus on the white working class warrior, because he's the only one in the conceptualization of these magazines that is capable of receiving the rewards without upsetting the patriarchy, the racial hierarchy in the United States in the 1950s and early 1960s. So I think that's a really important point. And so what the magazines do, or at least the ones that I found, they'll focus on athletes. Most of the African Americans are boxers, baseball players, and that's about it. Only occasionally will you see a sympathetic article of an African-American veteran returning home after World War II and having to deal with racism back in the United States. Only occasionally, very occasionally, will you see an African-American at the center of a storyline involving heroism. It's really only, I think, until the post-1965 that you see that in the Vietnam stories. And so that, I think, is where you see the intersections of who is allowed to be the hero in the story, being a part of everything that you laid out so eloquently about how there is a cultural component to this and an institutional component and a structural component that are all kind of, in a sense, limiting how we can tell the story, right? I think that's a really important point you made, is that these magazines not only narrow our definition of how we define manhood, it also, based on everything you laid out, from a larger perspective, narrow who can be in the story, not only how we tell it, but who can be in the story. Whether it's because of the rewards that are expected or how we want the hero to be constructed. And I think that there is a component of this institutionally within the Army itself that we don't talk about enough, that yes, there is a training component, but we don't talk enough, at least in my experience, of the cultural components of that training. That amazing scene at the beginning of the Full Metal Jacket, right, where the drill sergeant and all that has a cultural component before the drill and the basic training even starts, that we just don't really talk about all that much. And again, I think there is an institutional component to that clearly is influenced by the militarization of not just American foreign policy, but I would argue American society during the Cold War era. That and there's been some great work on this that I think is important. That not all Americans buy into this narrative clearly, which I do think is an important part of the story as well. Amy Rutenberg has discussed this, that not all young American men buy into this militarized ideal of masculinity. But I do think the larger militarization of American society, not just foreign policy, helps make these magazines and the messages make sense to their readers. And again, I think what we might suggest is that these cultural products are reflecting those institutional and systemic preferences that not just American policymakers, but I think most Americans embraced during the Cold War era, that somehow the institution of militarization, of the institution of segregation, the institution of the patriarchy, and our understanding of masculinity will help make us safer during the Cold War era. And so I think those were phenomenal points that you brought out. And I do think there clearly is, without a doubt here, a sense of white sexual imperialism that we just cannot deny. And I've gotten some amazing help during my research from collectors and who were very uncomfortable with me making that argument in this book, because for them it was something that, many of these collectors, that these are the magazines that their fathers and grandfathers were leaving scattered around the house, or they saw in barbershops, growing up, and to suggest that this was something more than just a friendly community for veterans to share stories, that this actually was reflecting some pretty awful aspects of white sexual imperialism. I think it was very uncomfortable for many of the folks that were helping me out in this storyline. But as you mentioned with the more recent, I don't know how better to say this, awfulness of the sex trade, right? That these magazines are basically doing the same thing. There's articles abound in these magazines of basically almost purchasing a Japanese woman, that these Japanese women are for sale. There's a company here in California, Newport Beach, that was kind of selling contacts for young, attractive Japanese women in particular, because they were supposed to be the exotic, Oriental, and submissive, and everything that you mentioned in your comments. And so I think there are some similarities here in terms of what these magazines are laying out for the readership. All right, I think I'm going to leave it there for right now, because I know there's a couple other questions out there. But that was really great, Amanda. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Greg. We do have some questions in the Q&A box, and again, just reminding the audience, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box or put your hand up, and we'll unmute you, and you're welcome to ask your question. We have a question from Wayne Lee, and none of the examples come from Soldier of Fortune, he writes, which lasted much longer. Sorry, I always have trouble reading this. It's bad eyes. Did this paradigm in the 1960s, did it evolve? And actually, if I just connect Wayne's question with a larger one I have, sort of what's the arc of the history of these magazines? In a sense, I imagine you did a lot of work in that. When do they begin? Is there like a moment when there's like and I have to admit, I didn't know Soldier of Fortune went that far back, but perhaps you know.
It doesn't go that far back. It actually, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So to answer your question, Joe, the foundation for these magazines really starts in the interwar period. Esquire is published, I believe, in 1933. There are coming out of World War I, a number of adventure magazines that will focus on like air war stories and flying airmen from World War I era. And it's not really until World War II where American soldiers deploy overseas and they bring the magazines with them. And so it's in the early 1950s that this specific genre of men's adventure magazines really takes hold, in large part because of young American veterans that are reading them. So there's kind of a, American GIs serving in World War II basically learned how to consume magazines and read them. Esquire clearly an important part of that with their pinup girls and the barter girls. And so that model, which is deemed successful in World War II, is then taken into the Cold War era. Soldier of Fortune begins in the mid-1970s, and so, and I mentioned this in the conclusion. And what I think happens is the magazines will basically split. So as I mentioned, these pulp magazines are a combination of the heroic warrior and the sexual conqueror. When that relationship no longer makes sense in the early and mid 1970s, the magazines split like this. And in one thread, these magazines, like Stag, as an example, which was a classic men's adventure magazine, turn into basically a smut magazine like We or Penthouse. It becomes a skin magazine, if you will. And at the same time, Soldier of Fortune gains in, is established and then gains in popularity, and it focuses solely on that heroic warrior. Again, focusing in on the heroic exploits of Vietnam veterans, and then when we go to into the late 70s and early 1980s, you'll see a focus on American veterans that are serving in South Africa or Angola or other places. And so what I think happens, like I said, is the magazine split apart. One aspect I'm focusing on the sexual component, and the other, like Soldier of Fortune, focusing on the warrior component.
Thanks, Greg. I just noticed we have some questions. Some people put their hands up, so I'll come back to the Q&A questions, but we have Kaylee McFadden. Would you like to just ask your question, please? Kaylee?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, Kaylee.
Okay. Hi. Kaylee. I'm a graduate student at Texas Tech, and so I just want to say hi and thank you. Yeah. So I just learned about the webinar last night in Dr. Milam's class.
Yeah.
He talked about your book, and I just want to say thank you for holding this because it was really interesting. And also for Dr. Chisholm for bringing up the sexual violence, especially in today's war. I too I'm a female veteran of the United States Army, and so it was something that I experienced, that firsthand I have knowledge of. So it's a very important topic. So thank you for bringing that up. So my question is, so from, I guess, from World War II to Vietnam, I guess the United States, we're coming off of a high, we're coming off of a win. And then obviously after Vietnam, we're coming off of a loss, or, you know, is kind of, that's just sort of how we are perceiving this war with Vietnam, is that, you know, we lost this. We lost a lot of lives, and it was not our best moment. So does that play into the mindset of the soldiers going into Iraq, that maybe you know, this idea of being a hero and everything, that maybe that was, it was structured differently because we're coming out of a loss, we're coming out of Vietnam, we're going into this war with Iraq, and it's a completely different war. How have the things changed, you know, as far as like making the American soldier masculine and making him feel like a warrior and a hero? Because I don't think the Middle East was considered exotic. I don't think, you know, those ideas of submissiveness and anything was there. So I'm guessing that the mindset had to be tweaked and modified differently. And I wonder if that also played into more of the sexual violence towards us female military veterans, because they would rather have sought us as a conquest rather than who we were there fighting. And because there's a lot more of us on boots on ground. Sorry if that came out. I was writing really fast, trying to like formulate all of this.
That's great. Thank Kelly. And please say hi to Professor Milam for me.
He might be on. So.
Well, if you are, hi, Ron. This is a really great question. And I've been struggling with this myself of, you know, if the construct in the magazines no longer makes sense, the heroic warrior combined with a sexual conqueror, what do we do with the expectations of military service being a man-making experience? My sense is that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, that heroic warrior narrative still enticed. If we think of young American men and women who joined the armed forces in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 with the expectation not only that they were going to defend the country in what we believe to be a time of war, but also with the expectation that by defending the country, they were going to receive some type of reward for that, not necessarily sexually, but at least in terms of how they define themselves as being masculine, being a hero. I think that was still at play. And I think we're culturally still struggling with this. I think even despite the last 15 to 20 years in both Iraq and Afghanistan, don't we still believe that war can provide an opportunity for us to demonstrate a level of heroism that will be a man-making experience? Now, I think we've seen plenty of evidence over the last 10 to 15 years in particular that kind of contests that expectation. If you think about the narrative of how we talk about veterans today, focusing less on the heroic warrior and more on what war has done. And this kind of gets again to what Amanda was talking about of what war does to us from a larger cultural perspective. I think in a sense that narrative may at least temporarily have replaced the heroic warrior narrative. That if we look at some great work that's been done by Dave Kieran as an example in his book Signature Wounds, which suggests that you know, our view, or at least culturally, of how we view veterans is focused on the wounds they sustained in war, and less of that has been bodily and more psychologically and mentally. So it will be interesting to see if we kind of move away from that narrative in the next 10 to 15 years. Again, we kind of saw the heroic warrior narrative in Vietnam dip in the 70s and then come back in full force in the 1980s. I'll be interested to see if something similar happens today. You know, as your question on whether, you know, that those sexual expectations in war move from the civilian population over to our own soldiers and fellow servicewomen? I don't know. It's a great question, and and to be quite frank, I just don't know the answer to that. I think there is a possibility for some, clearly, although I'm sure you've read as well a number of instances in World War II and in Vietnam as well, where WACs who were discussing their experiences of being behind chain link fences, not to keep the enemy out, but to keep American GIs out. So it's a good question. I just don't know the answer to that.
Thanks, Greg. I'm just going to bundle two questions from the Q&A function. Then I'll come back to Amber with your hand up. So Michael Nyberg, and hi, Michael, asks, did the DoD cooperate with the publishers with these magazines? And Marcel Burney asks, Gina Marie Weaver has recently argued that rape during Vietnam, America's war was much more widespread than frequently assumed. I would argue that that grave sexual violence was tolerated by the chain of command, although the acts clearly did not benefit the American ends in the war. How did racism and frustrated machismo interact in Vietnam? So it's quite a few questions in there, but sure. We don't want to try your patience tonight, Greg, but if we could go on for about 10 or 15 more minutes, that'd be great. Thank you.
It's not even 11:30 in the morning. Yeah, so Mike's question's a really good one. I think the answer is no, that the Department of Defense, the US government, did not specifically coordinate with the writers and artists of the Pulp magazines. This was, without a doubt, a specific private entity, although they clearly benefited from them. And these, the Pulp editors and the writers, as I mentioned, were very supportive of American policy, in American Cold War policy, and clearly benefited from the articles. The biggest cooperation I found in the magazine articles was some of the training bases opening themselves up to Pulp writers coming in and doing a story on basic training and demonstrating how this would be a great opportunity for young Americans to become a man by going through basic training. Marcel's question is a great one as well. Clearly, I think there was plenty of toleration of sexual violence and assault in Vietnam. There's no question about it. But the hardest part of my research was going into the War Crimes Working Group files in the National Archives in College Park in Maryland, and going through those files to look for similarities between the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ proceedings, and what was being portrayed in the magazines. The similarity in the language is disturbing. That Vietnamese women who would come to the chain of command saying that they were raped, but having, not surprisingly, having very little evidence of that, were dismissed out of hand. Much of that, I think, was based on racialized and sexist attitudes. Much of that, I think, was because the chain of command protecting their own soldiers. And as Amanda suggested too, I think part of it was this expectation or assumption that American soldiers just can't do this. They're good young boys. They would never go out and do something like this. So I think there was a toleration of these untoward acts against the population. I don't, however, think, as some have suggested, that this was part of American strategy in Vietnam. That I don't think that rape was used specifically as a strategic weapon of war, as we may have seen in places like Eastern Europe in the 1990s. I don't think that was the case. I've never found in any of my research senior military commanders turning a blind eye or saying that this was an acceptable behavior for Americans in Vietnam. Although at the lower chains of command, clearly, I think many commanders just turned a blind eye toward it. And so I do think there is a relationship here between racism and frustration and this militarized masculinity that interact in a way that is incredibly damaging to the civilian population in Vietnam, without a doubt.
I'm glad you raised that, Greg, because it was one of the fascinating things I found, that the way you looked to the court cases, to the prosecutions and the testimony, to connect the grammar and logic of the magazines to how the perpetrators describe themselves. It was fascinating. It's an interesting methodological innovation. Okay, Amber, can we bring you in now, please?
Hi.
Hi, Amber.
Hey, how are you, Greg?
Good, how are you?
Good. Okay, so I'm gonna try not to bring Playboy into this too much. I have two questions for you. One is about the Cheesecake women that were included. So we've talked a lot about race. Amanda brought up really good points about race and how that played in as well as you did. So with the Cheesecake women in particular, the ones who were like the accepted sexuality, did those women ever include different races? So did you see Black women, Asian women, anything like that included over time? And then also, Playboy switches very early on from their very men's pulpy, right? They have a couple of gold digger articles in the beginning, but they change over time. Did you see any of that in the Pulp magazines, where they started offering more complicated, or started maybe looking at accepting these different versions of masculinity, like the kind Playboy started to represent? Or did it stick very much to like that early 1950s view of like women and what it meant to be a man? And
no,
thank you.
Those are great questions. Thanks, Amber. I did not find any Cheesecake Girls that were not white. There were, there were some that were Australian and from Britain, but I didn't find any of the actual Cheesecake Girls that were not white. Now, clearly, many of the illustrations, as they're talking about sexual conquest overseas, and you saw some of the illustrations here, would include women from darker races, as the magazine writers would call them. But the actual Cheesecake Girls themselves were the girl next door image that I think was part, at least, of the Playboy experience, that you would know much better than I would. And then I don't think, Amber, that the magazines evolved all that much, and I think that's one of the reasons why they fell out of favor in the early 1970s. That the conservatism was present in the early 1950s and all the way through to the end of the 1960s and into the early 1970s. That women were still a threat to the these women that were willing to subvert the cultural norms and sexual norms of the day were just as much a threat to men in the late 1960s and early 70s as they were in the early 1950s. So I don't think the conception of both men and women in these magazines evolved that much over 2 decades when they were most popular.
Thank you, Greg. Got a question from Robert Thompson, who writes, he's a longtime fan and first-time listener. Do you know if these men's magazines ever address pacification in South Vietnam? And I suspect if this is the Robert Thompson I'm thinking of, I understand his question. And
Hi, Rob. That's a great question, and the answer is not as much. And I think the reason is because, as Rob probably knows better than many, there's not a lot of heroism to be gained in pacification missions. There are articles that will talk about what Heather Sturr has called the gentle warrior motif, meaning that showing these hardened warriors who also have a compassionate side to them. Heather demonstrates that in her book Beyond Combat, of how men could be seen as heroic warriors, but also compassionate toward the local population. And you will see instances of that in these magazines, but the pacification effort doesn't get a lot of play in the mid and late 1960s in these magazines, again, because it's not the type of storyline that the pulps want to be portraying. There's, you know, pacification, as Rob knows, is hard work. It's day in and day out working on the social and economic aspects of village and hamlet life in Vietnam. It's working on the betterment of local societies and trying to make linkages between villages and hamlets and provinces with the central government in Saigon. And very few of those storylines and plot lines lend themselves to the heroic warrior narrative. And so while the pulp articles and storylines will talk about the need to win over the population, they're really focusing more on combat engagements, because that's where we can demonstrate that American soldiers still have expertise at the tactical level, and can still hopefully demonstrate that even if there's problems at the strategic level, we're still making progress tactically on the battlefield.
Thanks, Greg. Jeremy Joseph asks, if the magazines are promoting bad behavior on personnel, was the Pentagon doing anything to counteract that?
Probably not as much as they should have been, clearly. There were initiatives in MACV at the Military Assistance Command headquarters in Vietnam to deal with issues of indiscipline that were increasing to rise in the late 1960s. Task forces set up for drug use, as an example, or indiscipline. We see a rise in what's known as fragging or fratricide, attempts at fratricide within the U.S. Armed Forces. But I have not found all that much in terms of a concerted effort to deal with the sexual assault harassment problem that is present in Vietnam. And as Marcel, argues, and Gina Marie Weaver does as well in her work, that the problem with all of this is, how do we get an accurate depiction of how widespread sexual violence and assault was in Vietnam? And I'm not so sure we're going to come to a conclusive answer on that anytime soon.
Ron Millen asks, with only 25%, minus 20% of men in Vietnam serving in combat units, if it seems these adventure magazines may have been read mostly by REMFs. In your research, did you find anything about discussion of and decisions made about the selling of the magazines versus Penthouse, Atom, Nugget, pornographic?
I did. There's some really interesting memorandum that are going back and forth between commanders in the field and those that are kind of running the PX system about what to do with these magazines, and concerns over maintaining GI morality while they're in Vietnam. Concerns about, if we think about Saigon being the, one big whorehouse, as a American senator actually called Saigon at the time. There are concerns, like in World War I and even World War II, that Americans are going to go to war and their morality will be challenged by the experience there. And so there is discussions about whether or not the PX system should in fact be continuing to fill the shelves with either pornographic magazines or adventure magazines. And in fact, the men's adventure magazines are kind of subsumed under pornography, because they have, as Amber mentioned, these Cheesecake Girls that are present in the magazines. There's never a conclusive decision made about this. And so even to the final years of American experience in Vietnam, those types of magazines are still being offered on the shelves right to the very end. Yeah.
Okay, we have one last question, and then if Amanda and Kaylee are happy, I just might swing back to ask Amanda to answer Kaylee's question that she replied to in the chat, if that's okay. Okay. You and Nguyen, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but he writes, hello, Dr. Daddis, and thank you very much for your presentation. Do you think that the rhetorical space that Pulp provided the soldiers as an excuse between the US and the GVN, especially in the latter phase of the heightened focus on pacification in the rural area, does Pulp background illustrate the focus more on the rural setting than in the urban setting? Thank you.
Yeah, they absolutely do focus more on the rural setting. There are kind of these some exotic stories of sexual opportunities that are available in Saigon. That's clearly a part of it. But most of the major storylines and plot lines are out in the field in combat. I don't know if soldiers themselves use the Pulps as an excuse for their actions. I didn't find any of that in my research. I didn't see a soldier that was, say, under UCMJ proceedings arguing that they did so because they thought it was acceptable given what they were reading in the magazines. So I don't think they were using these magazines as an excuse for what they had done. But again, I think what, as Carrie mentions in the piece here, I think it does open up this space for seeing something in war as acceptable. And the belief is that sexual violence is a component of modern war. In fact, probably not even modern war, just a component of war, period. And so, it's interesting, the backgrounds are set purposefully, right? That in rural settings, that's where you see the combat play out in the heroic warrior. And in the urban settings, especially Saigon, and most of the Pulp writers and editors just knew Saigon. They didn't know any other urban area. That's where most of the opportunities for what they believe would be consensual sex were occurring.
Thank you. Amanda, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry, quickly, just Kaylee, I think, it's such an important question about asking about how sexual politics and sexual violence plays out in the Middle East and with Arab women in particular. And I think, just as I put in the chat box, there's a long colonial linkage of sexual violence against Muslim and Arab women that from, again, Fanon in 1959 was writing about the whole violence of unveiling the women. You see this happening in the politics of France today. French politics, where you did see this in Afghanistan, in Iraq too. I think we do need to think about, the sexual violence is about power, domination, and submission. And so perhaps, U.S. Female serving soldiers are, like you said, maybe just more easily accessible in that regards, but it's about power, it's about domination. And I think, Greg, in your writing where you're talking about also US veterans reflecting on sexual violence too, whether they're firsthand or, experiencing it, a lot of their justifications around frustration, around, just this need to expression of manhood, of remasculating themselves through domination and whatnot, plays out in testimonies of, Maria Erikson-Boz and Maria Stern's article on why men rape, that looked at the DRC, male perpetrators of violence in the DRC, but also Rwanda, and Bosnia. Bosnia might have more of and Rwanda, a strategic femicide. Part of that rape was systematic rape to kill out or weed out particular ethnicities or women. But there is, a lot of that is also around frustration, that the end chain of command. Canadian soldiers in Somalia, right? The Rhodesian, Shireen Razak writes that very well about the weakening of chain of command to a very cohesive particular unit that make up their own rules or whatnot too. So fascinating topic. I won't take up any more time, but I just, again, thank you so much, Greg, for sharing your work with me and with us today. It's such important work. So thank you for that.
And thank you for your comments, sir. Just brilliant. I really appreciate it.
And let me echo Amanda, just again, thank you for a compelling presentation of your book. And I think certainly you're going to have more sales now. And I was remarkable, just the number of themes and approaches that you combined in one study. Really fantastic. And I'd like to just take some opportunity to thank the audience. We had some just great questions and great discussions. So thank you, everybody. And just to say, Greg, of course, we've recorded this, and I think we do get a lot of hits on YouTube. So I think this discussion will live on YouTube forever. Oh, sorry, there is one more question. We do have one more question, which is what are you working on next?
I'm looking at just starting to look at a larger work that examines the Cold War relationship that the United States has with war, and its understanding of war, and how war contributes to its national security and foreign policy in a way that I don't think is all that helpful. But I want to explore just that relationship between how policymakers and military leaders thought about war within the larger Cold War construct.
Sounds fascinating. We'll have you back live in London.
That'd be
great. It's great. Okay. Well, thanks again, and well, thanks everyone. And if the three panelists could stay on, and we'll just move into the I guess back room.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Have we, Lizzie, have we ended, or?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I think so. There isn't usually a back room, so I had to remove. I had to remove some of the people, and but it shows it can be done, I guess. There's not a way of like removing all the audience. There should be. It'd be great for Zoom to have that, actually.
Yeah, to come in and out of the space. Well, again, just first of all, thank you, Lizzie, for organizing this and running in the background.
No worries.
It would have been a disaster if I had to operate the control panel and chair. So thanks for that. And again, thank you both. And well, Greg, maybe we could chat sometime in the future, because I think you have a Center for History of Warfare. Yes. Now in San Diego, so perhaps there are opportunities for synergies. And
yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to do that. And once we're back to some sense of normal, get some folks out here for some discussions and events once we're outside of the pandemic, which is hopefully sooner than later. But yeah, we'd love to be able to start kind of focusing outward here, and I think we've got a great location to do that, and we've got I think a lot of faculty here at SDSU that are really excited about what we're trying to build here, and got a really good, solid core group of folks that I think we can kind of build something really big here in the United States, and then hopefully focus outward. So that'd be great.
Fantastic. Great. Okay.
Yeah, we'll have to get you and Amanda out here in maybe February, March timeframe, when it's a little grayer there than it is here.
Fantastic. Well, we're on the plane. Okay.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And if you ever want to do a feminist exploration of pop culture history, let me know, because I think I know you're engaging with feminism, but I just feel like there's more feminist questions in your archives that I personally like to dig deeper. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm teaching a war and gender course here in the spring. So maybe if we can stay in contact, even if we're not quite there yet, in terms of in person, maybe we can get you out for a conversation with the class.
Yeah, great, absolutely.
Well, perhaps a joint conference in 2022, maybe. Put out
that'd be
papers and
terrific. Yeah, because we talked about here of doing an event to kind of unveil the new center, and we just decided that Zoom was not the right venue to have a coming out party. So I think we're going to wait until the fall of 2021 to do that. But yeah, we would love to be able to kind of do some type of joint conference and, you know, have you folks out, and then, you know, maybe find some funding to bring some of our students and faculty out to you guys. That'd be terrific.
Well, there's our agenda. So
all right, sounds good.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.